The night comes not with a rush, but with a slow, deliberate settling, like silt sinking gently through deep, still water. Imagine, if you will, the very air itself slowing, thickening with the cool, benevolent dampness that drifts in from the eternal sea. This is Oakhaven, a place where time does not hurry, but rather stretches and yawns, inviting all within its embrace to do the same. Allow the sounds to wash over you, not as interruptions, but as an integral part of the quiet architecture of this coastal world. Listen for the distant, low moan of the foghorn, a sound so deep and so predictable that it acts less as a warning and more as the town's own slow, steady heartbeat, a comforting counterpoint to the hurried world left behind. It is a 3-second sigh, followed by a vast, empty stretch of silence, then the steady return of the soft, deep breath. Your breath, too, should begin to slow, matching the rhythm of the tide far below the breakwater. Inhale the scent of salt and ancient stone, of cooling moss and the faintest, sweet hint of brine. Feel the gentle weight of the air, not oppressive, but solid, like a heavy, comforting blanket. The story we are about to enter is not one of frantic searching or swift discovery, but of slow, quiet observation. It is about the subtle shift of the soul, the gradual, almost imperceptible way one life may drift into the orbit of another. Our protagonist, Elian Vance, is seeking stillness, and we, the listeners, shall find it alongside him. We will move through Oakhaven at a contemplative pace, examining the texture of old wood, the slow dance of dust in the light, and the methodical, soothing process of a heart coming home. Let your thoughts soften, let your body relax, and let the gentle, rhythmic cadence of the coming narrative guide you into a profound and lasting peace. The tide is turning, the time for rest has arrived. The small, rented cottage in Oakhaven was not found, it was discovered, the way one might discover a forgotten shell nestled perfectly in the sand, unassuming yet profoundly right. Elian Vance had driven the last leg of his journey not with urgency, but with a deliberate slowness that allowed the scenery to truly settle. The gradual exchange of inland green for the muted, complex colors of the coast, the cool grays of the shingles, the deep, dark blues of the water, and the almost perpetual, pearl-like mist that seemed to cling to everything. As he finally parked his worn, dependable estate car by the low stone wall, the silence that enveloped him was a palpable, luxurious thing, a velvet blanket woven from the absence of sharp noise. The only sounds were the ones of Oakhaven itself, timeless and slow, the persistent, soft whoosh of the waves far down on the obscured shingle beach, and the aforementioned, deep, paternal emotion of the lighthouse foghorn, a sound that resonated in the hollow of one's chest before melting back into the humid air. The cottage, named the Anchor's Rest. A name Elian found charmingly unoriginal and therefore perfectly suited. Stood just slightly back from the main coastal road, its front porch a study in gentle decay. The wood was weathered to a silvery gray, soft with the salt air and the passage of countless, slow seasons. He retrieved the large, antique-looking iron key from beneath the moss-covered flower pot, a transaction so slow and deliberate it felt like a ritual, a silent promise to the town to embrace its unhurried pace. The tumblers of the old lock clicked with a profound, almost musical thunk-tunk-clack, a sound full of finality and comfort. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, and the scent that greeted him was the definitive perfume of the sea-worn coast, a complex layering of damp earth, dried lavender left in a linen closet, and the persistent, underlying sharpness of salt. The interior was dim, the windows hazed by the coastal mist, filtering the late afternoon light into a soft, uniform gray. The floorboards, wide and dark, cried out a slow, melodic creak beneath his heavy boots with every step, a sound that spoke of history and resilience, a house settling comfortably into its own aging skin. He walked slowly through the small living space, running his fingers along the dusty mantelpiece, noticing the intricate, yet simple carvings that suggested the cottage had been built by a retired fisherman with nothing but time and quiet contemplation on his hands. He made a mental note of the repetitive details. The repeating pattern of a small ship carved into the wooden window frames, the same, simple rose motif on the ceramic door handles. A series of small, steady rhythms that promised predictability. Unpacking was not a chore, but an exercise in slow, quiet placement. He did not rush to empty the boxes. Instead, he carefully placed his tools of the trade. His brass compasses, his finely tipped drawing pens, and the heavy rolls of creamy, archival paper. Onto the sturdy, dark wood table that was to be his workbench. Each item was set down with a gentle tap, a sound that echoed softly in the quiet room before being absorbed completely by the thick air. The rhythm of this placement was hypnotic. Lift the box flap, draw out the object, position the object, pause, repeat. He spent a long, luxurious half-hour simply arranging his small collection of aged, leather-bound map folios, running his thumb over the worn gold lettering on the spines. The texture of the leather was cool and smooth, a comforting sensation in the quiet evening. As the light outside began its slow, inevitable retreat toward true darkness, Elian went to the small kitchen. The preparation of his first meal was a process of deliberate simplification. He boiled water in a heavy, whistling kettle that took an age to reach its pitch. The low, constant hiss that preceded the full whistle was a particularly soothing sound, a reminder that all good things require patience. He brewed a strong, dark tea, the steam rising in lazy, twisting columns, carrying the scent of bergamot into the stillness. He sat by the window, sipping the hot, fortifying liquid, his gaze fixed on the dense gray outside. The foghorn sounded again, a deep bass note that seemed to vibrate the glass of the windowpanes. It was a sound of profound loneliness, yet paradoxically, it filled the void left by the noise of the city, bringing with it a strange sense of companionship. It was the sound of a necessary constant, a reminder that the world was still moving, but at a pace entirely determined by the immense, slow forces of the water and the weather. Elian found himself breathing in sync with the horn's deep exhalation, his own thoughts slowing to a comfortable drift. He was here to map the coastlines, yes, to draw the physical reality of the Earth's edge, but more importantly, he was here to trace the contours of a much-needed internal quiet. He opened a book, a collection of very old, somewhat rambling maritime essays, but did not read. Instead, he simply held it, enjoying the slightly rough texture of the paper beneath his fingertips. The silence of the cottage, once a vast emptiness, was now being slowly filled by the subtle sounds of the structure itself, the occasional, soft tick of the cooling wood, the almost inaudible sigh of the wind finding a tiny gap in the window frame, the gentle, hypnotic drip of condensation falling from the eaves onto the moss below. The slowness was a weight, a heavy, welcome pressure that pressed all the anxiety out of him, leaving behind only the simple, profound fact of his presence here, now, in this quiet, salt-infused moment. He was settled. The night was vast and peaceful, and the coast waited. The next morning unfolded not with a sudden burst of light, but with the slow, almost reluctant withdrawal of the mist. Elian woke naturally, without the jarring interruption of an alarm, the quality of the light filtering through the linen curtain suggesting a mid-morning hour. He dressed in simple, dark wool and sturdy leather, taking time to lace his boots with a methodical, repetitive action that centered his thoughts. The goal for the day was simply to walk, to absorb Oakhaven not through a map's grid lines, but through the feel of its cobblestones and the slant of its light. His walk took him away from the immediate shore and toward the small, central core of the town. Oakhaven's main thoroughfare was not bustling, but rather characterized by a low hum of activity, the gentle clack-clack-clack of a few fishing boats being unloaded far down by the docks, the occasional, very distant and muffled sound of a single car's engine, and the soft, intermittent calling of gulls circling high above the rooftops. The streets were narrow, the buildings constructed of dark, heavy stone that seemed to absorb and retain the quiet, giving the entire area a sense of profound, settled permanence. It was in a side lane, tucked just slightly away from the smell of the fish market, that Elian found the shop. Its window was small and dusty, cluttered with an array of objects that seemed to have been placed not for display, but for slow, contemplative storage. A chipped porcelain doll lay next to a tarnished brass telescope, which rested against a stack of maps so yellowed they were almost brown. Above the door, a hand-painted, slightly faded sign read, simply, Ashworth Antiques and Curious. He paused before entering, taking a moment to inhale the subtle, complex scent that leaked out around the door frame, the deep, rich aroma of decaying paper, mixed with a hint of warm beeswax and the lingering, almost medicinal scent of dried sea lavender. He pushed the heavy, wooden door, and a tiny, almost apologetic brass bell above the frame gave a soft, single tinkle, a sound that seemed immediately muffled by the sheer volume of material within. The interior of the shop was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of quiet clutter. Every surface was covered, but not chaotically, rather, each item seemed to be resting in its appropriate, long-held place. The light inside was dim and golden, pierced only by thin, straight shafts that came from small windows high up on the wall. Within these narrow beams, the dust motes performed a slow, perpetual, and mesmerizing dance, floating, rising, and settling with a gentle grace that perfectly mirrored the pace of the town outside. It was a profoundly soothing spectacle. Elian began to browse, moving through the narrow aisles with a gait that was respectful of the old wood and the fragile objects. His feet, in their heavy boots, moved almost silently, stepping softly over the low ridges of the wooden floorboards. The sounds of the shop were internal and gentle, the soft, quiet scuff of his wool coat brushing against the spine of a tall stack of books, the faint, resonant clink of a glass stopper hitting the side of a glass bottle as he leaned in to examine a display, the low, continuous ticking of an unseen grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. He found himself in the back, near a section dedicated to very old, brittle maps and ledgers. He was running a careful, slow finger over the cover of an atlas when he finally saw her. Linnea Ashworth was seated at a large, dark-wood desk tucked into the rear corner, perfectly framed by a high window that offered a quiet view of the back alley and a patch of moss-covered slate roof. She was not startled by the sound of the bell. Perhaps she was accustomed to the slow, quiet trickle of visitors. And she did not immediately look up. She was utterly absorbed in her work, carefully cleaning a small, silver locket with a soft, worn piece of velvet cloth. The only sound she made was the faint, soft ssssh of the cloth rubbing against the tarnished metal, a sound as rhythmic and gentle as the sea itself. Her hair, the color of wet sand, was pulled back, and her concentration was complete, an island of stillness in the already quiet room. Elian stood for a long, silent moment, simply observing the methodical, careful nature of her labor. It was a hypnotic sight, the slow, repetitive gesture of her wrist, the gentle pressure applied to the tiny object. He did not feel compelled to interrupt her concentration, indeed, he felt an urge to protect it. It was a quiet moment of shared space, where his silence was a respectful appreciation of her focus. After perhaps a full minute, without lifting her head, she spoke. Her voice was low and smooth, a sound that blended perfectly with the shop's atmosphere, like another layer of the surrounding quiet. "Can I assist you, sir, or are you simply allowing the objects to speak to you?" The question was not demanding, but softly inquisitive, delivered in a tone that suggested she fully understood the pleasure of noncommittal browsing. "I am simply listening," Elian replied, his own voice a low murmur that he consciously kept from disrupting the shop's stillness. "The parchment here," it seems to whisper quite a lot about distance and time. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, the warm, deep color of aged amber, settled on his. There was no rush in her movement, no forced smile of commerce, only a settled, calm acknowledgement. "They do that," Linnea said, turning the silver locket carefully in her fingers, examining the tiny, polished spot. "These things hold the echo of their owner's patience. Or their impatience, for that matter. But mostly patience. The world hurries, but old things, and old towns, do not." She did not press him for a purchase, did not ask his name, and did not interrupt her slow, steady work. Elian simply nodded, appreciating the profound, unhurried nature of the exchange. It was the briefest of dialogues, a conversation conducted mostly through shared silence and an appreciation for slowness. He returned his gaze to the old atlas, his heart feeling a slight, almost imperceptible warmth, like a faint sunbeam finding its way through the mist. The shop was a refuge, and its proprietor a quiet, essential part of its stillness. He would leave, but he knew, with the settled certainty of a tide chart, that he would return. The tinkle of the bell as he exited was soft and farewell-like, fading almost instantly back into the deep quiet of Oakhaven. The essence of cartography, Elian always believed, was not in the drawing of lines but in the understanding of the space between them. It was about patience. Measuring the world one meticulous step at a time. His new routine in Oakhaven became a reflection of this philosophy, a daily meditation on slowness and repetition. Each morning, after the deep, lingering silence of his cottage, he would make his way down to the harbor, a route that allowed him to trace the physical edge of the land. His walks were not brisk exercises but contemplative drifts, his pace governed by the low, constant sound of the water. The rhythmic slosh-hush of the harbor waves against the inner wall was a hypnotic anchor for his thoughts. He would stop at the same spot each day, a section of the old, sea-battered stone seawall where the moss grew thick and dark in the deep crevices. From this vantage point, he could observe the slow life of the water. The lazy, circular patterns of the kelp just below the surface, the gentle bobbing of the handful of small fishing vessels moored in the safe depths, their rigging sighing with the lightest of winds. The water's surface was often a deep, matte gray, occasionally stirred into soft, slow ripples that fractured the reflection of the heavy, pewter-colored sky. His thoughts, during these long periods of observation, were as slow and as detailed as the work he performed on paper. He contemplated the nature of boundaries, how the sea did not observe the neat, inked lines of a map, how its edge was a constant negotiation between land and water, a slow, patient exchange defined by the moon and the tide. He would watch a single, small wave approach the wall, note its cresting, and then observe its quiet, retreating fall, repeating this visual study for minutes on end. The repetition was profoundly calming, a gentle rocking motion for his restless mind. One morning, the tide was particularly low, revealing a long, dark stretch of pebbled beach that was usually submerged. The sand was wet and tightly packed, bearing the swirling, etched patterns of the water's last full retreat. Elian descended the stone steps, a low thump of his boot on each riser, and began to walk along this newly revealed boundary. The sound under his feet was a gentle, complex scrunch as the pebbles gave way slightly under his weight. He was looking not for shells, but for the smooth, perfectly rounded stones. Objects that had spent uncountable decades being slowly shaped by the water's constant, benign friction. It was during one of these slow, meticulous scans of the ground that his quiet routine intersected, briefly, with Linnea's. She was not near the water, but rather tending to a small, enclosed flower bed that abutted the side of her antique shop, a small, unexpected splash of cultivated color against the ancient stone wall. She was moving with the same deliberate slowness that characterized her work inside. Kneeling carefully, weeding with a tiny, silver hand trowel. He stopped his own walk, standing quietly in the lane, the air between them heavy with the salty, clean scent of the morning. He observed her from a distance, the same respectful distance he maintained in her shop. Her movements were precise and unhurried. She would press the trowel into the soft, dark earth with a careful squelch, lift out the unwanted sprout, and place it gently into a small, woven basket. Her concentration was absolute, a profound state of engagement with a very small, very specific task. The only sound from her direction was the faint, rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff of the trowel against the soil and the low rustle of the leaves she was tending. Elian found this observation utterly soothing. There was a genuine, quiet beauty in the way she performed even the smallest, most mundane actions. It was not a grand or sudden realization, but a slow, steady appreciation for the rhythm of her life. She was an anchor in the busy, confusing storm of the modern world, a quiet vessel that understood the value of stillness. After perhaps 5 full minutes of this gentle, silent communion where she was unaware of his gaze, and he was content in his respectful distance that she finally paused her work, sitting back on her heels. She sighed, a slow, full exhalation that carried across the quiet lane, and then turned her head, her gaze sweeping the area with a calm indifference until it settled on him. She offered a small, soft nod, not a greeting that demanded conversation, but a simple, quiet acknowledgement of shared space and time. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," she murmured, her voice carrying lightly in the crisp air. She knew his name only because he had provided it once, on a small paper receipt for a very old, small magnifying glass he had purchased days earlier. A transaction conducted with only 5 words. "Good morning, Miss Ashworth," Elian replied, his tone mirroring her own low volume. She gestured toward the seaweed-strewn, wet expanse of the newly exposed beach. "The lowest tide this month, they say. It leaves behind quite a clean slate." "It does," Elian agreed, looking out at the expanse of dark, clean-swept sand. "A good reminder that everything eventually returns to simplicity, if you wait long enough." Linnea offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. A slow crinkle at the corner of her eyes. And then, without further conversation, she returned her attention to the slow, careful work of weeding, the chuff-chuff resuming its gentle rhythm. Elian nodded again, a final, quiet gesture, and then turned to resume his own methodical drift along the low tide mark. The interaction had lasted less than a minute, 2 simple exchanges of words, but it had subtly altered the feel of the morning. It had added a soft, predictable counterpoint to the established rhythm of his solitude, a gentle presence that was as calming as the repetitive sound of the waves themselves. His steps, as he walked the wet sand, felt a shade lighter, more purposefully measured. He knew now where he could find a constant, gentle stillness in Oakhaven, and it was not just in the slow turning of the tide. Oakhaven had a weather pattern that favored persistence over drama. On this particular day, the morning had begun with a light, almost invisible dampness, which by mid-afternoon had solidified into a soft, steady, and pervasive rain. It was not a harsh, driving downpour, but a relentless, gentle curtain of sound and water that muffled the world further, turning the already quiet town into a profound echo chamber. Elian had been out on the docks, attempting to sketch the precise, complicated geometry of a pile of discarded ropes and nets, but the increasing moisture had turned his paper pulpy and his ink runny. He had packed his things slowly, the movements of placing his tools back into their canvas bag methodical and resigned. He needed dry shelter, and the familiar draw of Ashworth Antiques and Curious became irresistible. He approached the shop with the heavy, wool collar of his coat pulled high, shaking the water from his hat before pushing the door inward. The soft tinkle of the bell was immediately absorbed by the deep, continuous sound that now dominated the interior, the drumming of the rain. It was a complex, layered noise. A low, persistent hiss on the slate roof, a higher, sharper tap-tap-tap on the glass of the front window, and a heavier, rhythmic plop-plop-plop as the water overspilled a blocked gutter pipe just outside. The combination was utterly hypnotic. Linnea was in the center of the shop, standing perfectly still behind her counter, her hands resting calmly on the dark wood surface. She was gazing out at the rain-streaked window, her expression placid and reflective. It was a picture of perfect stillness set against a background of continuous, gentle sound. She offered a slow, knowing glance as Elian entered, recognizing his need for quiet shelter. "The weather does not rush here, does it?" she asked, her voice pitched low, respecting the hushed, watery atmosphere. Elian hung his heavy coat on a peg by the door, the wool dripping softly onto the floorboards with a subtle pitter-patter sound. "No. It seems to commit entirely, but very quietly." He walked to the window, standing beside her, separated by the narrow width of the counter, and fixed his gaze on the mesmerizing, chaotic patterns the water made on the old glass. The next span of time was a profound example of shared, comfortable silence. They stood side by side, yet apart, the barrier of the counter a quiet boundary that allowed for mutual presence without the demand for interaction. The rain continued its steady, hypnotic performance. Elian found himself listening not only to the sound but to the quality of the light it produced, a beautiful, uniform gray that seemed to smooth away all the hard edges of the objects in the shop, making them appear softer, older, and more mysterious. He observed the way the dust motes, still floating, now seemed to move in slow, lazy spirals, their dance illuminated by the uniform glow. Linnea, perhaps sensing his deep appreciation for the sound, finally gestured to a large, empty stone crock sitting near the entrance. "I always keep a few cups of hot water in the back on days like this. If you don't mind the steam and the simple quiet, you are welcome to sit." Elian nodded his thanks. "I would welcome both." He followed her to a small, curtained-off alcove at the back, where a single, heavy kettle sat murmuring softly on a small burner. The sound of the boiling water was a quiet, intimate burble gurgle, a domestic sound of comfort set against the wilder, outdoor sound of the rain. She poured 2 mugs of plain hot water, offering him one. The steam immediately began to rise from the simple ceramic cup, twisting and dissipating in the cool air. The scent was minimal, just the clean, faintly metallic smell of heated water. They sat down on 2 mismatched, yet equally comfortable, low-backed chairs. The alcove was small, their knees almost touching, but the shared space felt easy and unforced. The only sounds in the immediate vicinity were the soft, persistent pft of the cooling water in their mugs and the low, continuous tick-tock of the unseen clock filtering in from the main shop. The dialogue that followed was brief, punctuated by long stretches of comfortable, profound quiet. "There is something about this kind of rain," Linnea said slowly, wrapping her hands around the warm mug, her voice barely a whisper. "It makes the past feel closer. Like all the years pressed into the stone are finally sighing out." "I find it a relief," Elian murmured back, watching the steady, quiet dissipation of the steam. "It simplifies the visual world. Removes the urgency. A cartographer appreciates a day when the horizon is completely blurred." She looked at him over the rim of her mug, a deep, thoughtful pause before she spoke again. "You are mapping more than the shoreline, aren't you, Mr. Vance?" He met her gaze, his own thoughts slowing to match the tempo of the falling rain. He did not deny it. "I am trying to map a place where the need to hurry does not exist. The coast is merely the best place to find that kind of stillness." Linnea offered no grand pronouncement, no advice or analysis. She simply nodded slowly, her understanding conveyed in the complete calm of her expression. She took a slow sip of the hot water, and the quiet settled back in, thicker and more profound than before. They sat that way for nearly an hour, two figures suspended in the damp, golden light, sharing the simple, profound sound of the steady rain. The rain continued its gentle, ceaseless rhythm, and the steam from their mugs provided a soft, repetitive visual counterpoint. It was a moment of deep, unhurried ease, where the shared silence felt more communicative than any string of frantic words. The world outside the antique shop was a blur of gray and water, but inside, in the company of old things and a quiet understanding, there was a perfect, settling warmth. The slowness of the hour was a luxurious weight, pressing them deeper into the comforting silence. The following days saw a subtle shift in Elian's purpose. While his coastal walks continued, now they were often preceded by a brief, non-committal stop at Ashworth Antiques. He was not yet a regular, but a deliberate, slow visitor, moving through the aisles with a quiet purpose that was not entirely about the items for sale. This time, however, he had a genuine, professional reason for his visit, a pretense that allowed for a deeper, more necessary interaction. He carried a section of his current cartographic project, a delicate, half-finished tracing of the Oakhaven harbor. The paper was large, creamy, and smelled faintly of the drafting materials he used, a clean, slightly sharp scent of graphite and fine ink. He placed the rolled map gently onto Linnea's broad, dark counter, the slow, soft unfurling sound of the heavy paper echoing slightly in the hushed room. "I have run into an obstacle that only someone with a deep memory of the town might solve," he explained, his voice low. "I am attempting to date the precise location of a long-removed breakwater. The existing nautical charts are too modern, and the historical notes are vague. I need to find the specific kind of hand-drawn reference that precedes the industrial era. A private ledger, perhaps, or a very early maritime diary." Linnea moved closer, drawn by the quality of the paper and the meticulous, precise nature of his work. She did not touch the map immediately but leaned in, her warm, quiet presence now close to his side. Her gaze swept slowly over the fine lines he had already drawn, up the meticulously shaded depths, the tiny, accurate placement of navigational markers. "You do not merely draw the lines, Mr. Vance," she murmured, her breath a soft, warm sigh near his ear. "You capture the stillness between the water and the stone. It's almost a portrait of quietude." "The stillness is the most important feature," Elian agreed, maintaining the low, reverent tone. "It is the constancy that allows for navigation. But the breakwater is a ghost line. It was there, and now it is not, and my map must show the was as much as the is. She straightened slowly, the silence returning as she considered his request. The sound of her slow, quiet thinking was palpable. Then, she walked with her characteristic, unhurried pace toward the back section of the shop, the faint, gentle creak of the floorboards marking her movement. Elian watched her, not impatiently, but with a quiet fascination for the methodical way she approached the task. She did not rush to a logical section, but moved with an intuitive grace, her hands running over the spines of various old, heavy volumes. Finally, she stopped before a stack of oversized, ledger-style books bound in brittle, dark green cloth. She selected one with a soft, careful thump and carried it back to the counter. The book was enormous, its pages thick and yellowed, smelling powerfully of old ink and dry paper. "This is an accounts ledger from the oldest fishing company in Oakhaven," she explained, carefully placing the heavy volume on the counter beside his map. "Not a chart, but a ledger. In the early years, the harbor master, who also handled the accounts, would occasionally fill in the blank-facing pages with small, personal sketches and notations about harbor alterations. He treated it like his own silent journal." She slowly, deliberately, opened the book. The pages rustled with a dry, whispery fshhfshh sound. The binding protested with a low, deep groan of old leather, a sound that quickly faded. She flipped through several pages of neat, faded columns of numbers until she found the section. It was a small, ink sketch. Not professional, but accurate enough. Beside it, in looping, ornate script, was a precise notation: new alignment of the south wall breakwater began June 1898. To extend only 30 feet east, avoiding the inner sandbar. Elian leaned closer, his focus intense, tracing the fine lines of the old sketch with his finger, careful not to touch the brittle paper. Linnea leaned in too, and for a long moment, their heads were close, the gentle warmth of her presence a soft counterpoint to the cool, precise geometry of the map and the old book. The scent of her faint lavender and old paper mingled pleasantly with the clean smell of his ink. 30 feet east, Elian murmured, the information settling quietly into his mind. That is the precise boundary I needed. Thank you, Miss Ashworth. It is a pleasure to connect the past to the present, Linnea replied, her voice remaining low and calm. Especially when the present is rendered with such quiet accuracy. They spent the next half hour not speaking, but working. Linnea provided small, gentle assistance, carefully holding the brittle, heavy pages of the ledger open while Elian used a thin, brass ruler and a nearly invisible line of light pencil to transfer the measurement onto his large map. The sounds were all small, gentle, and rhythmic: the faint, soft scratch of the graphite on the archival paper, the low, steady breathing of two people focused entirely on a task, the distant, almost inaudible tick-tock of the grandfather clock maintaining the slow, steady rhythm of time in the rest of the shop. The shared stillness was profound. It was not a grand act of romance, but an intimate, quiet collaboration. Two people united by their respect for accuracy, history, and the profound, beautiful slowness of detail. The light in the shop was shifting to the soft, golden hue of late afternoon, illuminating the dust motes around their heads in a slow, swirling cloud. The world outside could have been rushing by at a frantic pace, but inside Ashworth Antiques, time had slowed to the patient rhythm of a cartographer's careful hand and an antiquarian's quiet, certain knowledge. When the drawing was complete, Elian slowly rolled his map, the sound of the paper rolling back up into its tight cylinder a soft, satisfying whoosh of conclusion. He did not rush, savoring the final, quiet moment of the task's completion, knowing that the stillness they had shared was a far more valuable discovery than the 30 feet of long-lost breakwater. The resolution of the map detail deepened the quiet communion between Elian and Linnea. Their interactions now carried a comfortable, settled air, a soft certainty that their paths would cross in the tranquil confines of the shop. Their shared focus on historical detail provided a perfect shield against the need for hurried small talk, allowing their connection to grow through shared silences and mutual appreciation for the inanimate objects that held the town's slow history. Today, Linnea had something specific to share, a response to a passing comment Elian had made about the unusual density of the old stone used in Oakhaven's buildings. She led him, with her same unhurried pace, to a secluded corner of the shop where a small, ancient chest sat tucked away beneath a shelf laden with nautical instruments. The chest was made of dark, heavy oak, the iron fixtures tarnished black with age. "You asked about the stone," she murmured, the sound of her voice low and resonant, absorbed by the surrounding books. The earliest settlers were obsessed with durability, with building a place that would outlast the sea's eventual consumption. I believe this might provide a more personal insight than any geological survey. She lifted the lid of the chest slowly, the wood protesting with a low, deep groan that hung in the air for a moment before fading. The chest contained only one item, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth to the texture of soft river stone. The leather was so old it had lost all flexibility, holding the shape of the book with a brittle dignity. Linnea lifted the journal with extreme care, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed it gently on a padded surface near the counter. The scent that emanated from the book was intoxicating and complex. A strong, musty perfume of aged vellum, dried peat moss, and the faintest metallic tang of iron oxide from the ink. This belonged to the town's first designated stonecutter, Silas Thorne, she explained, carefully turning the pages, which rustled with a dry, papery wisp sound. It is not a daily diary, but a ledger of his materials, his methods, and his endless, quiet worry about the permanence of his work. Elian leaned in, his own breath slowing as he absorbed the object's sheer age and history. The pages were filled with elegant, faded script and small, detailed drawings of stone-cutting techniques. He noted the precise, repetitive way Thorne had described the quality of the local quarry stone, its grain, its resistance to the constant, salt-infused wind. Linnea pointed to a section where the ink was particularly faded, almost the color of weak tea. "Listen to this." He wrote, "The greatest strength is found in slowness. A stone that is rushed into shape will break. A town that is rushed into being will fall. We must match the sea's patience with our own." She read the words slowly, her voice taking on a gentle, almost meditative cadence that transformed the old script into a soothing incantation. The focus of the chapter became the sensory experience of the book. The look of the faded ink, the delicate feel of the page, the deep, settled meaning of the words. They sat side by side on two low stools, their proximity closer than they had ever been, their shoulders occasionally brushing with a soft, natural ease that required no comment. The silence was not empty, but filled with the presence of the forgotten craftsman and his quiet philosophy. Elian was utterly absorbed, his gaze tracing the lines of the faded ink, the methodical nature of Thorne's daily accounting for his slow, repetitive labor. He noted the constant, hypnotic repetition of words like measured, patient, and enduring throughout the journal. Linnea continued to slowly turn the pages, the rhythmic FSHH of the paper a soft, steady accompaniment to the deeper, background sounds of the shop, the low, constant ticking and the distant, muffled MOAN of the foghorn, which seemed particularly profound on this quiet afternoon. It wasn't just a building code, Elian finally murmured, his voice thick with realization. It was a philosophy of life. Build slowly, endure quietly. Oakhaven was built on quiet endurance, Linnea agreed, her amber eyes reflective. And that quiet still permeates every stone, every piece of wood. It requires the people who live here to slow down and listen to the foundations. They spent another long half-hour in this manner, simply sitting, reading and observing the texture of the past. The light streaming through the dusty high window had turned a warm, honey gold, casting long, peaceful shadows that stretched and settled across the floor. The rhythmic turning of the pages, the shared quiet breathing, the faint scent of old leather. All combined to create a sense of profound, settled ease. It was an intimacy built not on hurried confessions, but on the quiet, shared reverence for the slow processes of history and construction. When Linnea finally and carefully closed the heavy journal with a soft, final thump, the sound felt less like a conclusion and more like a gentle sealing of a shared secret. She returned the book to its chest with the same reverent slowness, and the final, deep thump of the oak lid closing was a comforting sound. Elian did not rush to leave. He lingered, savoring the aftermath of the shared history, the faint, comforting smell of the old leather still clinging to the air around them. The silence they shared was a quiet, warm pool, and they were resting peacefully at its depth. The deepening of their quiet connection led, inevitably, to a gentle expansion of their shared space. It was not a grand invitation, but a simple, unhurried suggestion on a late, misty afternoon when the sun had already begun its soft descent behind the western hills. Linnea was locking the heavy front door of the shop, the iron bolt sliding home with a solid, resonant thunk. Elian was waiting, having delayed his evening walk, drawn by the settling calm of the closing hour. "The shop is too full of things," Linnea said, turning to him, her voice a low murmur against the damp air. "But the space above is full only of quiet. If you do not mind the simplicity, I was about to prepare a slow tea." Elian accepted with a simple nod, the ease of the moment requiring no complex verbal affirmation. They ascended a narrow, steep set of wooden stairs tucked away in the back of the shop. The stairs were old, and the climb was slow and deliberate, each riser creaking a different, soft note in a slow, ascending arpeggio of creak-crick-crook. Linnea's living space was a small, low-ceilinged apartment characterized by its unpretentious, quiet order. The dominant colors were muted greens and deep, comfortable blues, colors borrowed from the sea and the surrounding nature. The air here was lighter than the shop below, carrying a clean scent of wood smoke. A faint, lingering perfume from a small stove. And fresh linen. The true focus of the next hour was the ritual of the tea, performed with a deliberate, beautiful slowness. Linnea moved with an economy of motion, each step precise and unhurried. The old kettle was already full, sitting on the stove, humming at a low, gentle pitch. The sound of the water beginning to truly boil was a gradual build, a low shhhhhhshhhhh whistle that was both patient and soothing. Elian sat at a small, round table covered with a simple, woven cloth. He watched the process, finding the meticulous nature of her task profoundly relaxing. She selected 2 plain, heavy ceramic mugs from a shelf. A soft, gentle clink-clink as the rims touched. She warmed the small, dark teapot with a dash of hot water, swirling it slowly. A low, liquid slosh. And then poured the warming water into a nearby plant pot. When the kettle finally reached a full, demanding whistle, she turned the heat off slowly, allowing the sound to gradually dissipate back into silence. She poured the water over the dark, loose tea leaves, the sound of the hot liquid hitting the porcelain a soft, hissing szzzzzzz. The aroma that immediately filled the room was dark and rich. A powerful, deep scent of black tea and a subtle hint of cinnamon. They waited patiently for the tea to steep, a deliberate silence settling over them. The only sound now was the gentle, rhythmic tick of the cooling water in the kettle and the distant, deep bass moyen of the foghorn, which seemed particularly warm and close from this vantage point. Linnea finally poured the tea. The sound of the thick liquid hitting the mugs was a warm, low glug-glug-glug. She slid a mug slowly across the table to Elian. The ceramic was warm and heavy in his hands. The steam rose in delicate, twisting plumes, carrying the fortifying scent directly to his face. The conversation that finally broke the silence was as simple and unhurried as the tea preparation. "This quiet," Elian said, taking a slow, appreciative sip, the warmth settling deep in his chest. "It is the most complex thing in Oakhaven. It is not empty, but layered." Linnea nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the rising steam from her own mug. "It is the sound of everything settling. When you stop listening for noise, you start hearing the things that have always been constant. The turning of the earth, the slow cooling of the stove, the even slower beat of your own heart." The silence returned, a blanket of comfort rather than a space to be filled. They sat for a long, luxurious period, simply sipping the hot tea. The light outside had faded to a deep indigo, and the small, low-wattage lamp on the table cast a gentle, golden pool of light over their mugs and hands. Elian observed the slow, hypnotic movement of the cooling steam, the way it twisted, paused, and then dissolved into the soft air. He watched Linnea's calm, settled posture, the way she held her mug. A picture of perfect, unforced repose. The only other sounds were the deep, continuous, repetitive hum of the town's quietness, the gentle clink of Elian setting his mug down, the soft, almost imperceptible sigh of the old building structure, and the periodic, comforting exhalation of the foghorn. The intimacy of the evening was not derived from any hurried confession or sudden, dramatic realization. It was born from the sustained, shared stillness, the comfortable knowledge that neither person felt the need to perform or impress. It was an intimacy of parallel silence, a slow, gentle realization that their individual rhythms. The cartographer's slow measurement, the antiquarian's quiet patience that were perfectly aligned, two pendulums swinging in the same, easy arc. When Elian finally stood to leave, the silence followed him, a warm, pervasive feeling that the quiet heart of Oakhaven now held a deeper, more personal anchor for him. The slow, creaking descent down the stairs felt like the gentle, reluctant drift away from a warm, safe harbor. The slow, steady progression of their quiet friendship eventually led them out of the sheltered warmth of the cottage and the shop and into the vast, open quiet of the Oakhaven night. Following a particularly deep, misty sunset point, one that bled the sky of all color, leaving only shades of navy and charcoal, Linnea suggested a walk to the breakwater. "The foghorn is particularly dense tonight," she murmured, zipping her heavy, dark jacket slowly. "It feels like a night where the lighthouse needs company. It is a lonely job, maintaining a constant rhythm." The walk was slow and deliberate, their pace perfectly matched. The cobblestones under their feet were damp and slick, and they moved with a careful, quiet attention to the ground. The only sound that accompanied them was the pervasive, deep emotion of the foghorn, now much closer, its resonance vibrating slightly in their chests with each exhalation. The sound was so predictable, so constant in its rhythm. A 3-second bellow, followed by 45 seconds of profound silence. That it became a form of hypnotic music, a deep, slow meditation on time and constancy. They reached the breakwater, a long, rough stretch of man-made stone that jutted far out into the open water, protecting the harbor's quiet interior. The air here was sharp, intensely cold, and saturated with the clean, raw scent of the open sea. They walked the length of it slowly, side by side, their arms occasionally brushing with a gentle, static friction. At the very end of the breakwater stood the Oakhaven lighthouse, a tall, white sentinel, its stone base thick and deeply scarred by centuries of weather. The light itself was the main character of the scene. It did not flash or jitter, instead, it moved with a majestic, unhurried predictability. The lamp rotated with a smooth, mechanical whir, a sound almost inaudible beneath the louder, deeper sounds of the sea. The beam swept toward them slowly, a powerful, focused shaft of pure, cold light. It illuminated the wet, black stone of the breakwater with a sudden, startling clarity, turning the water momentarily into a sheet of silver. Then, as slowly as it had arrived, it passed, leaving them instantly plunged back into the deep, misty dark. There was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds. A period of intense, deep quiet. Before the light would begin its gentle, slow return, creeping back from the distant horizon. This repetitive, hypnotic cycle became the focal point of their shared quietude. The sounds of the sea were the only variations on the theme, the deep, constant throsh of the waves hitting the massive stones below, and the low, sucking sss suck of the water retreating. "It is the perfect metaphor, isn't it?" Linnea murmured, her voice barely audible above the constant water sounds. She was wrapped tightly in her coat, her gaze fixed on the darkness where the light had just been. "The light?" Elian replied, his own voice low, feeling the vibration of the coming foghorn in the stones beneath his feet. "The rhythm," she corrected, slowly. "It is always there. It never hurries. It never gets frantic. It simply performs its duty, predictably, steadily, through all the hours of all the nights. The greatest reassurance is found in the constant return." The light returned, sweeping over them in its slow, deliberate arc. In the moment of pure illumination, Elian turned his head slightly to look at Linnea. Her profile was sharp and beautiful in the cold, bright beam. Her eyes wide, reflecting the light like polished amber, her expression one of perfect, quiet contemplation. It was a clear, sudden glimpse of profound inner peace, framed by the chaos of the mist and the immensity of the ocean. Then the light was gone, and the deep, silent darkness enveloped them once more. In that space of darkness and quiet, just before the next emotion of the foghorn, Elian reached out slowly and placed his hand, with a deliberate, unhurried gentleness, over hers. Her hand was cold from the night air, but beneath his touch, she did not withdraw. Instead, her fingers curled slowly and naturally around his, a profound, quiet anchoring in the deep, vast darkness. There was no sudden, passionate dialogue, no hurried declaration. The action was as slow, steady, and inevitable as the turning of the light. It was a confirmation that they were two fixed points, sharing a constant rhythm in a world that often spun too fast. The sound of the next foghorn blast, when it came, felt like a deep, warm seal upon their shared silence. They stood that way for a long, quiet time, their hands clasped in a silent, comforting affirmation, the repetitive cycle of the light and the horn washing over them, an endless, soothing mantra. Their love was not a sudden explosion of feeling, but a deep, constant pulse, as predictable and enduring as the stone foundation beneath their feet. The quiet comfort of their joined hands, the hypnotic repetition of the elements. The cold mist, the steady water, the rhythmic light. All served to deepen the profound, unhurried peace of the moment. The walk back along the breakwater was slower still, their silence now enriched by the unspoken, settled knowledge of their mutual bond, a bond as fixed as the North Star. The quiet, settled confirmation of their relationship did not accelerate the pace of their lives in Oakhaven, rather, it deepened the appreciation for their slowness. The following morning was clear, the mist having retreated entirely, leaving behind a crisp, cool air and a brilliant, low-slung sun that cast long, peaceful shadows. They decided to spend the morning on the less frequented stretch of beach, a quiet, wide expanse of pale sand and small, smooth stones that lay south of the harbor. Their walk there was unhurried, their hands remaining comfortably clasped, their steps matching a deliberate, easy tempo. The sand was cool and slightly wet from the night's high tide, packed firm enough to make walking easy. The sound of their feet was a low, uniform shuffle hush, a gentle, rhythmic friction against the wet grains. The activity they chose was equally devoid of urgency, an exercise in pure, repetitive contemplation. Elian picked up a long, sun-bleached piece of driftwood, its surface smoothed by years of water tumbling. With a slow, deliberate movement, he began to draw large, sweeping patterns in the wet, dark sand. He was not sketching a scene, but tracing abstract, mesmerizing geometries. Perfect, slowly rendered circles, long, parallel lines that followed the curve of the water, and intricate, intersecting spirals. The sound of the wood dragging through the wet sand was a continuous, subtle SSSCCHRRR, a low, satisfying sound of resistance and creation. Elian performed this task with the same meticulous care he applied to his cartography, his focus absolute, his movements fluid and slow. The creation of these temporary, beautiful patterns became a form of active meditation. Linnea, meanwhile, was engaged in her own quiet ritual. She walked a few feet ahead of him, her gaze fixed on the ground, searching for specific stones. She was only interested in the small, gray, perfectly smooth ones, those that had been tumbled by the sea for so long that all edges had been polished away. Her bending and straightening was a slow, gentle motion, her hands moving with a delicate precision as she sifted through the pebbles. The only sound from her was the faint, soft clink 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 as a selected stone was dropped into the deep pocket of her coat, a tiny, percussive sound absorbed almost immediately by the vastness of the beach. It was a slow, repetitive act of collecting, a search for perfection in the repetitive natural world. The atmosphere was dominated by the deep, continuous sound of the sea. The waves here were larger and slower than in the sheltered harbor, rolling in with a majestic, profound whoosh and retreating with a long, whispering sh, leaving a gentle, frothy lace at the edge of the sand. This low, constant roar provided a powerful, soothing sonic backdrop to their individual, quiet rituals. For over an hour, they continued this parallel, meditative work. Elian created a massive, perfect spiral, his steps circling slowly outward from a central point, the SSSCCHHRRR of the driftwood, a continuous, hypnotic drone. Linnea moved slowly along the water's edge, occasionally pausing to hold a stone up to the pale morning light, examining its smooth perfection before dropping it with a small, satisfying clink. Their shared presence was deeply calming. There was no need for conversation, no need to interrupt the profound stillness of their concentration. Their connection was expressed in the shared appreciation for the slow, meticulous creation and collection that the beauty of small, repetitive actions performed with absolute focus. The patterns Elian drew were temporary, destined to be erased by the return of the tide, and the stones Linnea collected were subtle, unglamorous finds. Yet, in their quiet, shared moment, they possessed a deep, enduring value. Finally, Elian completed his last, large arc of the spiral. He straightened slowly, stretching his back, and placed the driftwood gently down on the dry sand. Linnea, having filled her pocket, walked back to him, her gait slow and settled. She stood beside him, and together they looked down at the massive, temporary drawing, a cartography of the moment, soon to be washed clean. "It is a peaceful feeling," Elian murmured, looking at the pattern. "To create something knowing it will be taken away. There is no permanence, only the moment of the making." Linnea reached into her pocket and drew out a handful of the smooth, gray stones. She poured them slowly into his open palm. The stones were cool and heavy, settling into his hand with a soft, warm chirr sound. "Permanence," she said, her voice low and soft, "is in the material. These stones have been doing this for millennia. And the moment of the making is in the rhythm. It is always in the rhythm." She did not elaborate. She simply turned and began the slow, rhythmic walk back up the beach, her hand finding his. The sound of the waves, the quiet shuffle hush of their footsteps, and the solid, comfortable weight of the smooth stones in Elian's pocket combined to create a sense of profound, settled permanence. It was a love found in the slow, constant processes of the world, a connection as deep and enduring as the stones beneath their feet. The quiet comfort of their companionship deepened over the next few weeks, settling into the easy, unhurried rhythm that defined Oakhaven itself. Their connection was not marked by large, dramatic events, but by the accumulation of small, quiet shared moments, the methodical preparation of simple meals in Elian's cottage, the long, silent reading sessions in Linnea's shop, punctuated only by the occasional, soft SSS sigh of a page turning. The moment of quiet confirmation arrived not on the vast, dramatic breakwater, but in the contained, familiar stillness of Ashworth Antiques, during one of their slow, afternoon browses. The light in the shop was a pale, diffused gold, filtering through the high, dirty windows and illuminating the omnipresent, slow dance of the dust motes. Elian was examining a display case filled with small, navigational instruments. Tarnished brass sextants, tiny, silver-cased barometers, and pocket-sized telescopes. He was drawn to a very old, simple compass. It was housed in a heavy, dark wooden box, the brass fittings tarnished green, its glass face cloudy with age. He lifted it out gently, the weight of the object surprising him. When he opened the lid, the needle, which should have been frantic or stuck, performed an incredibly slow, deliberate rotation. Instead of snapping quickly to north, the magnetic indicator drifted in a wide, gentle arc, seemingly reluctant to settle. It turned with a mesmerizing slowness. A full 30 seconds passed, accompanied by the faintest, almost inaudible SSSSKRR of the pivot, before it finally came to a near-complete stop, trembling lightly on the north point. Linnea had approached quietly from behind, drawn by the stillness of his focus. She did not speak, simply standing close, her quiet presence a warm weight in the air. "It is broken, in the conventional sense," Elian murmured, his gaze fixed on the slowly settling needle. "It refuses to hurry. It seems to have all the time in the world to find its direction." "The compass of Oakhaven," Linnea replied, her voice soft, her chin resting gently on his shoulder, a casual, deep intimacy that required no complex thought. "It knows that truth found quickly is often brittle. Truth must settle slowly, like the dust in this room." She reached out her hand slowly, with a deliberate, unhurried movement, and gently touched the side of the wooden case. The slight, almost imperceptible vibration of her touch was enough to send the needle back into a slow, gentle drift. It began its rotation anew, a slow, deliberate search for true north. This movement became the focus of their shared quietude. They stood absolutely still, breathing in tandem, their concentration entirely absorbed by the hypnotic, slow turning of the needle. The only sounds were the SSSSKRR of the pivot, their two slow, steady breaths, and the low, continuous background tick-tock of the grandfather clock. The realization of their love was not marked by a sudden, decisive statement, but by the quiet, shared observation of the slowly settling needle. Elian did not need to speak of his feelings, and Linnea did not need to ask. They understood, with a profound, unhurried certainty, that they had found their mutual direction, a true north defined by stillness and patience. When the needle finally settled for the second time, pointing to the familiar, settled symbol for north, Elian slowly lowered the box and turned his body to face her. There was no rush, no sudden movement. His hands, still holding the compass box, gently reached up to frame her face, his thumbs slowly, softly brushing her cheekbones. The movement was so gentle, so slow, that it felt like a continuation of the needle's own deliberate path. "Linnea," he said, his voice quiet, deep, and steady, a tone that contained the settled weight of his absolute certainty. She smiled at that faint, slow crinkle at the corners of her amber eyes and leaned into his touch, her movement as unhurried and natural as the tide. "I know, Elian. The direction is set. It was always going to be slow." He closed the final, fractional distance between them with a deep, careful slowness, his kiss a gentle, quiet pressing of intention. Not a climax, but a deep, long, quiet period that marked the end of the search and the beginning of a sustained, settled path. They held the moment, standing utterly still in the soft, golden light, the scent of old paper and dust motes surrounding them. The confirmation was complete, as quiet and as settled as the compass needle in the dark wooden box. It was a love found in the refusal to hurry, a realization as slow and as beautiful as the turning of the earth itself. When they finally separated, the only change in the room was the quality of the stillness. It was now richer, warmer, and more profound. With the quiet confirmation of their shared path, Elian's cartographic work took on a new, internalized meaning. He continued to draft the physical boundaries of Oakhaven, meticulously rendering the jagged coastlines, the precise locations of the old seawalls, and the depths of the inner harbor. However, his work became a metaphor for his own internal life, a slow, thoughtful process of charting the emotional topography of his settled existence. He set up his drafting table in Linnea's small living space above the shop, the location itself a quiet statement of his permanence. The sounds of his work were now woven into the fabric of her daily life, that the soft scritch of his fine pen on the heavy paper, the almost inaudible whir of his compass as he drew a perfect circle, the gentle thump of his heavy brass ruler being moved and realigned. These were the new, comfortable rhythms of their shared home. The focus of this chapter was the methodical, repetitive nature of his work, contrasted with the calm, steady presence of Linnea below. While drawing the contours of the inner harbor, the most protected, quiet part of the town, Elian's mind would drift into a peaceful contemplation of how quiet, steady affection was the most powerful, enduring force. He was mapping the true Oakhaven, the one defined not by longitude and latitude, but by the quiet constants, the angle of the afternoon sun through the dusty pane, the location of the small, warm stove, and the sound of Linnea's gentle humming as she worked below. He meticulously inked the spot where her shop stood, treating it not as a commercial point, but as the true, fixed center of his map, giving it a deliberate, quiet reverence in his otherwise precise drawing. He spent an entire afternoon simply detailing the harbor's rigging. He was drawing the complex network of ropes and pulleys on the docked vessels, the hundreds of tiny lines that crisscrossed the air. The sound he was trying to capture, in his mind, was the deep, sorrowful sigh of the wind moving through that rigging, a sound that was often masked by the louder sounds of the docks, but which was profoundly present in the stillness of the late day. It was the sound of the air being slowed down, its rushing energy transformed into a gentle, mournful song. Linnea came up the stairs slowly, her steps announcing her arrival with the familiar creak-crick-crook, carrying 2 mugs of warm, unadorned milk, its scent clean and faintly sweet. She placed one mug on his desk, careful not to disturb his tools, the heavy ceramic making a soft thud on the wood. She did not ask about his progress, simply standing behind him, watching his careful, deliberate hand movements. "You're drawing the quiet," she murmured, her voice a low compliment to the surrounding stillness. "I'm drawing the anchors," Elian corrected, without lifting his gaze from the tiny, precise ink line he was laying down. "The things that hold the chaos at bay. The stone, the thick, heavy rope, the deep, settled floor of the harbor. The things that require slowness to be effective." She rubbed his shoulders with a slow, steady pressure, a gesture of profound, unhurried ease. The action was repetitive and soothing. "The finest anchor," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is not a piece of iron, but a deep, steady rhythm that another soul can match. Your map is finally finished because you have found your deepest sound." They stood that way for a long time, the only sounds the methodical scritch of the pen, the soft sigh of the wind in the distant rigging, and the slow, rhythmic thump-thump of their own hearts beating in close proximity. The aroma of the warm milk filled the small room, a domestic, comforting scent of peace. The rest of the chapter passed in the rhythmic repetition of his final drafts, the careful cleaning of his pens, the slow, satisfying application of the final coat of protective varnish, the smell of which, a clean, sweet chemical scent, became the final perfume of his completed work. His maps were finished. They were perfect. They were not only accurate charts of the physical world but quiet, enduring representations of the settled state of his own heart, a heart that had found its final, permanent harbor in the profound quietude of Oakhaven, anchored by the stillness of Linnea. The final scene of their story was not a peak of action, but a sustained, quiet plateau of profound domestic peace. It was a cold, deep night in Oakhaven, the kind of night where the heavy stone houses seemed to absorb all sound, leaving the air outside thick and silent, broken only by the reliable, distant moan of the lighthouse. Elian and Linnea were seated together in their small living space above the antique shop. The room was warmed by the low, continuous heat from the small wood stove, the air saturated with the comforting scent of very slow, low-burning oak. The only light came from a single, heavy lamp with a thick, amber glass shade, which cast a small, golden pool over the round table and the book they were sharing. They were reading together, not speaking the words aloud, but sharing the physical act of the story. The book was one of Linnea's oldest, a heavy, leather-bound collection of folklore from the northern coast, its pages creamy and thick. Elian was leaning back in his chair, his head resting lightly against the back of Linnea's, his eyes slowly scanning the text. Her arm was tucked comfortably around his, her hand resting over his heart. The atmosphere was entirely dominated by the small, rhythmic, comforting sounds of their shared repose. The most dominant sound was the low, steady tick-tick-tick of the small clock on the mantel, its metallic rhythm a domestic counterpart to the massive, slow pulse of the foghorn outside. The fire in the stove produced a soft, steady hush-crackle sound, the sound of matter slowly turning to energy, a constant source of warm, slow sound. The rhythm of the reading was a hypnotic one. Elian's eyes would travel the page, his breath remaining slow and even. Linnea would occasionally reach out with her free hand and turn the brittle page with a soft, careful fshh sound. A pause. A gentle adjustment of posture. A few more minutes of shared, comfortable silence. The only dialogue was internal, an unspoken acknowledgement of the complete, unforced safety of the moment. They eventually paused, not because of a dramatic shift in the story, but simply because the rhythm of the quiet demanded a moment of complete stillness. Elian lifted his hand slowly and placed it over Linnea's, which was still resting over his heart. He felt the light, steady, comforting thump-thump of his own life beneath her palm. "I never thought," Elian murmured, his voice low, his words a slow drift in the warm air, "that stillness could be so complete. That peace could be a constant, not a fleeting break." Linnea simply tightened her arm around him, a gentle, sustained pressure that spoke volumes. "It's the patience, Elian. We let it all move slowly. We let the quiet settle in the foundation. It doesn't rush away because we never forced it to hurry in the first place." The confirmation of their love was entirely contained within this simple, domestic scene. There was no need for grand plans for the future, no urgent need for travel or change. The future was simply a continuation of this deep, quiet present, the shared warmth, the slow, comfortable breathing, the rhythmic ticking of the clock, the distant sigh of the sea. Elian reached slowly to the small table and took a sip of his now cool water, the ceramic cup making a soft clink against the wood. He then settled back, his gaze returning to the amber glow of the lamp, his mind entirely at rest. The low, deep emotion of the foghorn sounded again, a profound, slow exhalation that seemed to wrap around the cottage like a final, comforting embrace. They sat together as the hours passed, two settled souls, anchored firmly in the stillness of Oakhaven. The constant, repetitive sounds of their life, the tick-tick-tick, the hush-crackle, the distant, rhythmic emotion that were a silent, enduring promise. Their love was not an adventure, but a safe harbor, a deep, quiet, and utterly permanent peace, as predictable and enduring as the slow, turning of the tide. The search was over. The map was complete. They were home.